We're finally out of chapter 3. Obviously the last lesson we finished verse 29. And today we're now into chapter 4. Here, finally, after the bulk of our time. We've spent almost half of the course thus far going through chapter 3, which is appropriate. It is the kind of epicenter of the entire book, certainly from a theological perspective. But now we're moving on to chapter 4. What we're doing really is today's lesson and next lesson, there is a significant overlap between the two. The two lessons, or the total passage I'm referring to is verses 1 through to 11, so 1 to 11. We, for our sake, are going to subdivide it into today's lesson, which is verses 1 to 7, and then the next lesson, which will be verses 8 to 11. The overlap will primarily be in the next lesson, where we'll be referring back quite a lot. So they're almost, in a sense, a part 1 and part 2 of what is largely the same lesson in terms of the key takeaways or key points that we're trying to learn here. By virtue of that, naturally, there will be things that I could try and cram into this lesson that I won't, that I'll save for the next lesson. So elements of things untouched will be covered in that next lesson, definitely, if that makes sense. But anyway, as long as we understand that as the structure, we can then understand how we're kind of going to approach it, so that you understand the connection that exists between our arbitrary subdivision of these two sections for us, right? Of course, as with anything else, it's important to remember that these are letters. The chapter and verse divisions are highly valuable inventions of the last 1,000 years, roughly speaking, in Christianity. These are letters that are just simply written. So obviously what we've been seeing through chapter 3 is building what we then will see now for us in chapter 4 here. There's a number of key topics relating to adoption, the notion of slavery, redemption on the flip side of that. There are some very profound philosophical aspects, which I'm going to do my best to try and condense and explain for us, at least in terms of the essence of them. It's a bit of a pun based on what we're going to be looking at, but at least the kind of foundational aspects that are important for us to learn without it turning into a history lesson or a philosophical lecture on the structure of pre-Socratic philosophy. The reason why it's important to understand it is because of the context, and again, I'll enumerate what I mean by that as we kind of work our way through, because like with anything else, this passage is no less historically tied to the time period in which it's written as anything else we've been seeing thus far throughout Galatians. So let's proceed as normal. We'll read the passage. So today, as I said, verses 1 to 7, and then we'll go from there. So Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and stewards until the date set by the father. So also we, while we were children, were enslaved under the elemental things of the world. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, let's begin in verse 1. Now I say, this little intro is a fairly common rhetorical device in ancient, particularly Hellenistic literature. It's a transition in the subject matter that is not disconnected from that which comes prior to it, but serves to kind of conjoin two different sets or pieces of subject matter. Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything. Before we move to verse 2. What he's doing here in verses 1 and 2 is he's giving an analogy. Okay, this is completely analogous language, right? He's using an analogy, an example, that will demonstrate the point that he's trying to draw throughout the rest of the verses that come later on, particularly obviously through to verse 7 as we have today. So understanding that context, we can then understand, okay, we're approaching this as an analogy. The analogy being that of inheritance. Now we've seen this already in chapter 3. Like I said in the introduction, this is obviously building on what's come beforehand. We've seen this discussion of the language of son or of child. Again, the generic term, the term actually used here is for a child, a minor, right? So age is an apparent factor in this analogy. I'll explain more about that as we go through. But what you'll find here, which is already beginning to develop in this passage for us today, is a phrase which was featured more than once in the previous chapter, right? And it's this language of son or sonship or sons of God, right? We explained in chapter 3 that this is a titular reference, so in other words, title. Okay, it's not speaking biologically; it's speaking in a different sense of sons in the titular form, right, in the analogous form. This case analogously, but titularly nonetheless, right? So it's why Christianity is referred to as a brotherhood, right? For example, in regards to the words of the Apostle Peter, love the brotherhood, right? Understanding that in this language of adoption, again, obviously adoption is something which is specific. In this case, we're talking about heirship, right? So inheritance of something. The analogy that's being drawn is of a child, a firstborn, of course, probably most primarily. It doesn't necessarily mention firstborn, but that's the image in view. Who is due to obviously inherit his father's estate, right? Inherit that which his father owns by right. Okay. When he is a minor, which is what that English word child is in your English translation, he doesn't own anything, not in the legal sense. This was the case in every single culture. It's the case, obviously, still today. And keeping in mind, of course, obviously he, as in the Apostle Paul, is living in a time of the Roman Empire, right? A very highly advanced legal system, governmental, civic system, etc., where these things were very thoroughly drawn out and well developed from a legal or jurisprudential standpoint. The heir is a child when he is, so in other words, as long as he is a child, he does not differ from a slave, although he is the owner of everything. Owner in this context, he actually uses the word kyrios, if I'm not mistaken. He differs from a slave owner. Yeah, kyrios, meaning Lord. Okay, he's using Lord here in the generic sense, not the divine sense, of course. The Lord is referred to as the Lord, and that's the divine application of that word. Kyrios, Kyrios, if you want to think of it in English, is also used for anyone from a father to a civil magistrate, a commander of military unit, etc., right? Someone who is in a position of authority or command, right? A lord in that sense, right? He is Lord of everything. In other words, he is the one who will inherit. It will become his, but whilst he's a child, it is not actually his, okay? There is this time aspect that's playing in, especially as we have for us in English, as long as the heir is a child is usually something how it should be roughly translated.
Are children requested to work?
In an element, yes. So children have, and obviously not until a certain age, but children in this context, again, good question, I need to delineate one point. We today in the modern world have this magical twilight zone of a category called teenagehood or adolescence, which means getting all the rights of adulthood and absolutely none of the responsibilities. That's usually how it ends up playing out. Throughout the other 99% of human history, they were not under such delusions. And so you were a boy and then a man, you were a girl and then a woman, right? Childhood or a minor is that category. Up to a certain point, children were just simply children, and that varied from culture to culture. but usually it would be certainly somewhere between 7 to 10, roughly speaking, around that time when a child, still a child at that point, a boy for example, would start to undertake more meaningful preparations for adulthood or manhood, right? And again, vice versa for women, girls and women. So working and doing labour was certainly a more common feature from about the age of 7 onward, not obviously like an adult, but certainly working up to that point. Because by the time you enter the age of about, again, varied from culture to culture, but largely going off the biological aspect, so you're talking 12, 13-ish years of age, that would be the natural transition into manhood or womanhood. And so a young man is what we would today call a teenager, or maybe even early 20s, although usually it was just what we would call a teenager today. That was a young man or a young woman. So yes, children would do certainly elements of work. What that looked like, again, varied significantly, but it would be about preparation for adulthood. Yeah, good question. And so they're due to, and that's actually, but it's a good question because it touches on part of what his point is here in this analogy, which is that the child, the minor that's being referred to, is described as the lord of everything or the owner of everything because he will become that, right? It's his by right. But it's not his yet because he is not a man yet. He's not an adult. But rather in verse 2 is described as being under guardians and stewards until the date set by his father, right, of when he will be legally allowed to inherit things. Okay, so he's using a real world familial and legal analogy to describe the point that he's now making about religion. Okay, interesting words he uses here. Guardian, in regards to guardians and stewards. What do your words say in your English translations? Do they say
Managers and trustees.
Trustees is fine, yep.
Managers, but he's under guardians and managers.
Totally fine as well. Yeah, guardians and managers, yeah. Yep. No, all those are fun. Just trying to see what your translation is picking up. Yeah, guardians is fairly straightforward. Epitropos, someone who guards or oversees, so a guardian aspect. And then oikonomos, which is where that word for steward or trustee or what was the other one, manager, I think. Oikonomos, and we're going to spend a bit of time here just to explain what this means, because he uses words which are deeply rooted in Greco-Roman culture. Epitropos, fairly simple word. I'm using the root word here in their the root singular form. Is someone who oversees, someone who watches over, someone who guards and protects. Again, that's why guardians is usually how that should be brought into English. It's one who has oversight. It's a similar, not exactly the same, but similar word to that of episkopos, which is where we get the word bishop or overseer in the Bible. So in regards to the clergy, okay, the prefix of that word epi. Some of you, if you have medical backgrounds, will know it from things like epigenetics, for example, or other such things. It means upon or over. Okay, in this context, tropos to see or to watch. So one who oversees, one who is a guardian, right? So there's this inherent authority and protectorship that's incumbent in that word. But the second one is also quite interesting. It is the Greek word, as I said, oikonomos. If you're wanting to write notes, O-I-K-O. I'm transliterating here, but O-I-K-O-N-O-M-O-S. Oikonomos. Actually, where we get the English word economy from. So oikonomos, via Latin and French later on, becomes economy. It comes from the root oikos, which means house. Just a simple word for house or household, and in its root form, nomos, which means law. More broadly from that, namos, which means to manage. So that's why some of your English translations might say manager. The word economy is household management. That's what it means. It's always the great irony of subjects like home economics, for example, is home management. But nevertheless, to manage the household, right? The term of an economy, even as we use it today for national economies, is tied to this notion of managing the funds, the production, the sales, everything else of the household, tying back to this root concept of the Greek oikos, which means a house. The people, the actual, obviously, the building itself, the place, etc. So one who is a manager, or one who is a trustee, again, I think your translation says as well, can also be described as a steward, okay, someone who manages things, right? He's using both of these terms. Again, they're very, very familiar to the ancient Greco-Roman audience, these two words of guardianship and stewardship. So for us, contextually, the reason why we wanted to understand that is obviously to then place it in the rest of the sentence. The heir, who is no different from a slave, because even though he owns everything, is such because he is under guardians and stewards until the date set by his father as to when he will inherit things. Okay, so that's verse 1 and verse 2 are the analogy that's being drawn, right? The child, right, the son, though he will inherit things, that is something that will happen at a future point in terms of at that stage in his life as a child. He is much like a slave. He actually owns nothing in the immediate literal sense. But rather he is under the stewardship, the guardianship, the trusteeship, etc. in English, of others until the date of his inheritance set by the father. Right? Are we all clear in the analogy he's trying to make here? Yeah. So, understanding that, verse 3 is now where he connects that analogy to the point, the theological point he's now trying to make. Right? So verse 3, so also we, so now drawing comparison between verse 1 and verse 2 to us as Christians, so also we, while we were children, he's speaking spiritually here, were enslaved under the elemental things of the world. Now, this is where we start to get into the more the deep, the more complex elements of philosophy, as it were, concerning basically, well, not just this passage obviously, but next week's passage as well. The phrase he uses here is stoicheia. It is a very, very common word among the ancient Hellenistic philosophers, in other words, the ancient Greek philosophers particularly. In fact, it is one of the fundamental aspects of ancient philosophy, or called classical philosophy, so from Greek and later on Roman philosophical sources. Stoicheia refers, and we can translate it in various different ways, elemental things, elemental principles. How does verse 3 end in your translations?
We're enslaved to the elementary principles of the world.
Yep, elementary principles. Fine,
Elements of the world.
Elements of the world. That's
Elemental spiritual forces of the world.
Yep, that can work. It's a bit more abstract, but that's one of the ways it can be brought in. It's more of a conceptual translation, but yes, it's certainly applicable. So let's explain what this is meaning. Right, this is going to become particularly relevant in the next lesson. So I'm going to I will explain X amount and then put a cap on it, because much of what we then get into, especially in verse 8, which is a really significant verse, is where we'll then actually unpack that in a deeper and more profound way, if that makes sense, okay? But at least to give you the fundamental principles, pardon the pun, the elementary principles, here. History and philosophy time. The ancient Greek philosophers were by orders of magnitude the most significantly developed of any of the ancient pagan thinkers, as compared to the Egyptians, the Assyrians, Babylonians, etc. Part of this, and the way that the church has understood this, going all the way back to, of course, the early church period, given the fact that they themselves were Greek and Latins largely, in the days of the Roman Empire, is that God, in a sense, not just merely kind of presented this, but rather developed it in a sense of almost planting the seed among the Greeks, who, of course, by and large became the first recipients among the Gentiles of the gospel. They weren't literally the first, but in terms of mass numbers, Of course, all these eastern parts of the Mediterranean world, the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, were Greek. Okay, they were Greek ethnically in many respects. They were Greek culturally, definitely. They were Greek linguistically. Again, Greek in the 1st century AD is what we call the lingua franca, right? It's the common language. It's what English is to the world today. People spoke Greek primarily because 300 years prior, of course, to this time that we're reading in here, Alexander the Great conquered the majority of the known world. Okay, and the spread of Hellenistic culture, meaning Hellenistic, just to make sure there's no confusion, it does not mean hell. It's referring to Hellas, which is the Greek name for Greece. Hellenistic or Greek culture. Spread, of course, far and wide around the eastern Mediterranean world, what we call in historical terms the ancient Near East, or today the Middle East. By virtue of this, of course, religion, economics, philosophy, okay, so the worldview of how people actually understood the world, either entirely supplanted the indigenous worldview and religious system, or in many instances, especially like the Egyptians, it syncretized. In other words, it mixed in with it, right? And so from that time onward all the way to the end of the Egyptian dynasties, like that of the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last of whom was Cleopatra, Greek and Egyptian religion was completely intermixed and intertwined. Why is that so significant? Well, for a variety of reasons, and it's primarily to do with us contextually here in Galatia. You may, of course, recall that Galatia was a bit of what's what I'm looking for? A mixed bag, as it were. Okay, it's a bit of a fruit salad, ethnically and culturally. The Galatians, as people, we explained this at the very beginning of this Bible study course on Galatians, are actually a Celtic people. Okay, they are a Celtic offshoot. The Celts, like myself, my ancestors, primarily the residents of Western Europe and especially the British Isles, the insular Celts. But this offshoot had migrated all the way across in centuries prior. Deeply and heavily intermixed with the Greeks, like I'm saying, as other people were as well. And you have this interesting melting pot, so to speak, in the Galatian churches of southern Galatia, which is where we are regionally, where you have ethnic Jews, ethnic Greeks, and ethnic Celts in the form of the Galatians, literally. Okay. By virtue of this, again, Greek philosophy, Greek religion, Greek culture, Greek language being the predominant aspect or forces in this region, his reference to stoicheia, to the elemental principles, the elementary things, the elements just simply, is something which they immediately would have understood. So, what is he actually referring to? The ancient Greeks, beginning with what we call the pre-Socratic philosophers, so Socrates I'm using as a reference here. Socrates lives in the late 5th century BC, so the 400s BC. He lives in the latter half of that century primarily. We refer to the ancient Greek philosophers as either Socratic philosophers, so in other words, those who come after Socrates, those like his student Plato and Plato's student Aristotle, of course, being among the most famous. And then we refer to philosophers as pre-Socratic, so those who came before him. The ancient Greek philosophers were greatly intrigued with the nature of reality, with physics, what was called physics at the time. Physics had to do with more than just what the scientific field of physics today. Physics also, it obviously dealt with that, but it also dealt with the philosophical aspect of it particularly, by virtue of the fact that philosophy was the very mechanism, as it were, by which everything was understood. The world was understood to comprise of 4 elements, okay? Earth, air, water, and fire. Later on, Socrates adds a 5th element called ether. So if you've ever heard the phrase ethereal, for example, or someone having an idea that's come out of the ether, ether was a reference among the Aristotle and the post-Aristotelian philosophers to the substance that they hypothesized existed in space, what we call space, and that held the elements of the stars and the planets together. Why is this important for us to understand? These fundamental elements which is where we get, or stoicheia, which is what this word is. It's one word in the Greek, were concerning the fundamental nature of reality from the ancient Greek philosophical perspective. Again, I'm greatly oversimplifying and condensing this subject for the sake of simplicity and time. Various different even the pre-Socratic philosophers, but many of the ancient Greek philosophers had their own thoughts about what was, as they referred to, the arche, A-R-C-H-E, the arche, meaning the beginning or the first element, the element that brought into being other elements. Okay, Thales, again, you don't remember these names or these principles, but just to give you examples, Thales of Miletos believed that it was water. Heraclitus believed that it was air, if I remember correctly. Actually, no, sorry, he thought it was fire. Anaximenos believed it was air. There were various different thoughts among these philosophers. Later on, you would eventually, actually, rather contemporaneously, actually, quite frankly, you would eventually, get onto a period where I believe it was Epictetus. Let me refresh my memory. Yes, of Ephesus is where he first enumerates the idea of the logos. All right, and this is very important for you to understand. Again, the philosophy lesson is not just so that we can fill in time. The logos is the ancient Greek concept, and you will be familiar with this, of course, from John chapter 1, because the Apostle John directly talks about this in his what we call the Johannine prologue, or the prologue of John's Gospel. Okay, so the first 18 verses of John chapter 1. Right. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? Now, this is where there's such a direct importance. Again, part of this will become more relevant in the next lesson, quite frankly, because we will eventually get onto that point more specifically in regards to verse 8, which I read earlier, which I mentioned earlier. But amidst all the various propositions among the ancient Greek philosophers as to what was the first element, the arche, this proposition of the logos, which was first articulated in Ephesus, actually, funnily enough, of course, Ephesus being one of the churches established during that early period, in which we have a letter as well from the Apostle Paul, became central to our understanding of what was the nature of reality, the nature of the universe, the nature of the cosmos, as the Greeks would, of course, refer to it. In our case, again, speaking of John 1, he identifies the logos as the beginning of all things, right? And he does so literally, okay? En arche en ho logos, kai o logos proston theon, kai theon en ho logos. Okay? In the beginning was the word, en arche, right, which is that word beginning that I mentioned, A-R-C-H-E for you in English. In the beginning was hologos, the word. Okay? Kaiologos proston theon, and the word was with God. Kai theon en hologos, and literally God was the word, or in English, the word was God, in other words, by nature. Right? That simple sentence alone is one of the most profound things ever written in the history of philosophy. Not because it identifies the logos as the creative power or force of all things in existence, because the ancient Greeks had identified that in their own philosophies. Again, the belief that now prevailed was that the logos, this concept of, which is obviously where we get the word logic from, right? But it's what literally means the word, or the speech, the spoken thing, was that which brought into existence everything that exists and also sustains it. Now, the ancient Greeks did not identify this as a person, but rather as a force, or as, in many senses, a kind of stoicheia, a kind of element like water, air, earth, fire, or later on for Aristotle as well, ether, in that particular case. The reason why this is so vital, the reason why it's so important, is because of the fact that John attributes to that logos personhood. Okay? He attributes to that logos, personhood. And that is the first time that occurs in history. It's why, for example, when the Apostle Paul is in Athens in Acts chapter 17, I'm paraphrasing here obviously, but he describes the Greeks as having kind of clawed their way in the dark toward God, right? Because from an intellectual perspective, from the perspective of philosophy or of worldview, right, understanding of the nature of reality and how it works, no one among the pagans had gotten closer to the truth than the Greeks. As I said earlier in the lesson, by quite a margin, in fact. No shortage of elements of pagan belief. Again, the Greeks were shockingly superstitious, religiously speaking. Sometimes still are, God bless them. But in this particular case, from a philosophical perspective, no one had a more comprehensive, highly developed system of understanding the world around them than the Greeks. It's why their philosophical works are still remembered and taught to this day, right? And obviously, as someone who is trained academically in philosophy and in the classics, who has read the classics academically, those things occur, like my own education, because of how significant they are in regards to understanding. It's then no surprise that, by and large, in terms of the mass numbers, the primary people among the Gentiles to whom the gospel went forth were the Greeks. Certainly, at least in regards to culture, religion, politics, language, etc., etc. It was fertile soil for understanding Christianity and understanding the gospel going forth to the nations, right? So, all of this is to give us this basic understanding of what is meant by stoicheia. Again, if you want it spelled, again, I'll transliterate for you, but stoicheia, at least in English. Stoicheia, if you want to pronounce it, stoicheia. Elements, elementary principles, elementary things, elementals, etc., etc. Again, you can bring that into English in a couple of different ways. The reason why one's English translation might say elemental spirit is by virtue of what we'll talk about in the next lesson, right? That aspect, the spiritual aspect, I'll save till the next lesson because that's more directly focused, especially for verse 8, right? So I'll save that explanation for that portion, if that makes sense, right? But nevertheless, what's being described in verse 3, on the back of this analogy in verses 1 and 2, so also we, Christians, while we were children, he's speaking religiously here, spiritually in other words, were enslaved under the stoicheia of the world, okay? The elemental principles, or the stoicheia to cosmo, the elementary things or elemental principles of the world. Right? Again, we'll talk more about what that means spiritually in the next lesson, but you need to understand at least he's describing us as, again, he's speaking time here, and this is going to become a more important point as we continue on the next couple of verses. There is a time factor to all of this, okay? To bridge the gap of what I mean, going back to verse 1, now I say, as long as the heir is a child, right, as long as he's introducing the element of time into the discussion. Do you understand that? Yep. So also we, while we were children, so drawing an analogy, that he's talking about things from a transcendent perspective in regards to time. Okay, and this is going to become really, really apparent as we continue on. Right? Verse 4. But when the fullness of time came, hence why I point this out, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Now, there's a number of things to unpack here. He uses a literary device here in verse 4, okay, that we're going to divide into 3 clauses. Right? When the fullness of time came, right, I'll get back to that in a second, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. 1, 2, 3. Right? And again, hopefully English grammar with commas there helps you out. Right? God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Okay? Now, we'll back up and begin. I just wanted to point that out before then starting to unpack it chronologically. But when the fullness of time came, does anyone else have anything else other than fullness of time? That's what you'll say? Fullness of time. Beginning of verse 4? Set time, same thing. Yep, set time had fully come, totally fine. When the fullness of time had come, the pleroma, which means fullness or completion, the set point, yeah, that's totally fine as well. The fullness of time or the completion of time, when the appointed time had come, okay, is another valid way of saying that in English as well. Right? When the fullness of time had come. Now, here's where his analogy really starts drawing in. Okay, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ from a slave, although he is the owner of everything. Verse 1. Okay, he's under guardians, he's under stewards until the date set by the father, right? By his own dad, in other words. Okay, the date set, right? Fast forward, verse 4. But when the set time came, right, when the fullness of time had come, God then sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. What he's doing is he's showing the Galatian Christians their place in history. Ironically, we actually just talked about this yesterday during our sermon. Right? It's not the only time, of course. Chapter 11 in Deuteronomy features this concept a number of times of the past informing the present in order to guide and direct the future. Okay, and all under the kind of sovereign purview of God himself. When the fullness of time had come, when the set time had come, the appointed time. In other words, to put it simply, when the time that God had planned for these things to occur had arrived, right? When the ordained time, to use another phrase, had come, then X, Y, Z. In our case here for verse 4, God sent forth his son, 1, born of a woman, 2, born under the law, 3. Okay? And this is important to unpack what's being actually said kind of beneath the surface in these phrases. God sent forth his son, born of a woman. In clause 1 and clause 2, you have the divine and the human nature of Christ. Okay? He sent forth his son, demonstrating his pre-existence. Okay, the son did not come into being when he was born of a woman. It says that God sent forth his son, born of a woman. Okay, there's an order to this. It is picking up on the same philosophical concept that features perhaps most famously in Isaiah chapter 9 verse 6, which is, of course, where we preach from in the first week of Advent. Okay. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given. Okay? We've explained many times before that those are not meant to be pithy words, although they do seem that way. A child being born and a son being given is quite literally what this phrase is. Right? A child being born, i.e. born of woman, a son being given, i.e. God sent forth his son. Okay, it's the exact same phrase, just obviously in the next order. But a child being born, a son being given, is demonstrating the pre-existence of this son. Okay, he did not come into existence with the birth, right? Otherwise he couldn't be given. He wouldn't exist, obviously. The son being given demonstrates that this one pre-exists, which is exactly the philosophical concept of the logos, okay, among the Greek philosophers. This is why, of course, John picks up on this concept, especially when he then gets to verse 14 in John chapter 1, right? Kai ho logos ein sarx egenetor, right? And the word became flesh and dwelt among us, as he goes on to say, egenetor eskenosen, right? To dwell among us. The word became flesh, in other words, adopted or took on flesh, in other words, humanity, right, the material, and eskenosen, ein chemin, right, dwelt among us. Okay? He became flesh. The Logos did this, right? The pre-existent Logos, the creative and sustaining power of the universe, which is a short, simple way of saying what the Greeks believed, then became material, okay, and dwelt among us. This is this human aspect that's obviously being spoken of. This is the kind of concept he's picking up on, right? At the appointed time, the fullness of time, the set time, various ways of saying it in English, God sent forth his Son, okay, born of a woman and born under the law. So, purpose, nature, outcome, okay? What he's doing here is he's touching on two fundamental aspects of what we call metaphysics. Metaphysics is just simply, although it sounds like a complex word, is simply the philosophy of the nature of being, right? So what is existence? What is humanity? What is time, etc., right? So it's the study of the nature of being or existence, okay? Metaphysics. Two basic elements of metaphysics, which, again, the complexities of the words aside, are actually very simple concepts. And you probably actually heard me utilize these terms on multiple occasions, okay? The ontology and the teleology. Ontology, ontos, meaning nature or being. Teleology, telos, T-E-L-O-S, telos, meaning purpose or end, okay? So when you hear me use complex words like ontology or teleology, it is simply referring to the nature of something and the purpose of something. Okay. Why is that so relevant? Well, because in these three clauses we have both the ontology of the Lord and the teleology. He sent forth his Son, born of a woman, that's the ontology, so that's the nature, divine and human, born under the law so that he might redeem those who were under the law. That's the telos, that's the purpose or the end. In other words, the goal, right? That's the purpose, telos. Okay? Both these fundamental aspects. Again, Paul is speaking very, very philosophically here. This is by virtue of obviously he's educated in philosophy. Actually, the previous Bible study during Acts, a Bible study in Acts, is where we more look specifically at kind of Paul, the Apostle Paul, the man, as it were. He himself obviously was a highly educated rabbi. That was his Judaic training. He was educated in philosophy and other such subjects at the University of Tarsus, which was his hometown, where he was from, and he was also, of course, a Roman citizen as well. His family was. Not high-ranking, but low-ranking citizenship nonetheless. By knowledge of this, or by virtue of this, pardon me, he uses this knowledge to describe these things. And again, all these concepts, even to congregants, as it were, everyday people in the churches in Galatia, these are concepts which they're very familiar with, right? There may well have been philosophers among them, who knows? But certainly these basic elements, these are fundamental aspects of their own worldview, right? And their own understanding of the world as those who are culturally Greek, obviously even some of them ethnically Greek, of course, okay? So he's describing things philosophically. This is why, just as a very brief tangent, without letting it run away from me, there is a necessary balance that must exist in the Christian religion between intellectual dedication and perhaps what we might call head knowledge that is very dead spiritually. Okay, at certain times in Christian history, in church history, times and places and cultures have become too imbalanced one direction or another. There were certain points where things became very heavily intellectualized, with much of the pathos or the emotion, the compassional element, perhaps let slide. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, which church it is specifically, I need to remember. Perhaps it was the Ephesians. Nevertheless, one of the churches in Revelation were described as having lost their first love, and I'm pretty sure it's the Church of Ephesus. But I will hopefully be able to scan my way through and find out very quickly if that's correct. Yes, it is Ephesus. Okay, good, I was correct. So chapter 2, verse 4. But I have this against you, he says to the church in Ephesus, the Lord speaking, that you have left your first love. Okay? Therefore remember from where you have fallen, repent and do the deeds that you did at first. Right? They lost their first love, right? He commends them for doing good things. He actually commends them earlier on in prior verses for being very concerned with making sure that they keep heresy at bay, that they fight against evil, etc., etc., but they lost their first love, right? So it's the kind of cold, dead intellectualism. On the other hand, though, is the opposite problem at the other end of the spectrum, which is a never-ending stream of feelings and very little to no actual intellectual rigor or development, okay? If not even a marked anti-intellectualism. We live in this kind of time over here, not the Ephesian one, right? We live more in the time where intellectual rigor or commitment to study, to knowledge, to growing in wisdom, etc., is at best allowed to kind of waste away, or even in many cases actually frowned upon, right, and looked down upon, including even in the seminaries to a degree which is shocking. But from personal experience, you can take my word. It's dangerous because, as we understand through the scriptures, we're called to have wisdom, but wisdom is built upon knowledge. Hence why, of course, multiple times when God's people fall into error and into sin, especially at the national levels, the Lord laments that his people perish for a lack of knowledge. Okay? My people perish for a lack of knowledge. Right? They are destroyed because they have abandoned truth. And again, how do we know truth but without, of course, as the word suggests, knowing it? This is why the Apostle Paul, the very same, says in Romans chapter 10, how shall people believe unless they have heard, and how shall people hear unless someone is sent to them? Okay, people can't believe in what they don't know. That should seem obvious. In this particular case, this is why he's kind of touching very deeply on these philosophical elements, and it's why we constantly try to strike the balance, at least here, with having a well-developed or well-rounded approach to things, if that makes sense, right? The practical and the intellectual are both equally as necessary as each other, okay? And just as the emotional and the intellectual are equally as important as each other. In this particular case, understanding some of these basic philosophical elements is really important to actually understanding what on earth he's talking about, because otherwise you will miss it, right? These things have a particular context, and this passage is a perfect example of it, right? There's plenty of simplicity to this passage, but there's also significant layers of complexity. In this case, again, that aspect of ontology, right? So the nature of who the Son is. God sends forth his Son, pre-existence, the Logos, born of a woman, he's also human, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who are under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. That's the telos, or the purpose, okay? Then, of course, let us unpack what on earth this telos actually is, right? Before we eventually get through to verse 7, and then we're actually going to circle back to the beginning of verse 4 to tie it all off for ourselves, right? Verse 5, so that he might redeem those who were under the law. Now, he uses actually a very powerful word, which again they all would have understood. It's only used a couple of times in the New Testament. It's used much more often in the Old Testament. In fact, we've actually encountered it a multiplicity of times in Deuteronomy. If we were to read the Greek version of it, the Septuagint, we would have encountered this multiple times. Exagorazo, which means to redeem or to purchase out of slavery. Right? To purchase out of slavery. If you're interested in spelling it, translate it into English, what would that be? Exagorazo, so E-X-A-G-O-R-A-Z-O would be the most appropriate, right? Okay. Exagor, that's okay, yep. E-X-A-Gorazo, G-O-R-A-Z-O. Exagorazo. Means to redeem or to purchase out of slavery. Okay, so we've encountered this in Deuteronomy a multitude of times, where God is described as He who redeemed you from the house of slavery, right, from the land of Egypt. Okay, in terms of referring back to the Exodus, of course. In our particular case, again, this is literally the word that's applied to describe those who are purchased at a slave auction, okay? Who are bought at a slave market, for example. So we're described, again, giving the wording in that sentence, so that He might, exagorazo, right, redeem those who were under the law, that He might purchase us out of slavery, us who were under the law. This is where it ties back analogously to us in verse 1, right? As long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, right? Though he owns everything, or in other words, though he will inherit it all, right? But at this set time, the appointed time, the fullness of time, as the beginning of verse 4, connecting that aspect of time, right? Set by the date set by the Father at the end of verse 2. He has, as in the Son that is, redeemed us. He has purchased us out of slavery. Okay? So He's redeemed us. And in this case, being under the law, obviously He's combining here the Israelite aspect of the Mosaic law and the Greek philosophical aspect of the stoicheia, the elementary principles. Again, I'm going to explain more about how that specifically relates to each other when we get to verse 8 in the next lesson, right? But either way, He's combining these aspects and describing us, both the ethnically Jewish Christians, the ethnically Greek, ethnically Celt Christians, as being enslaved to these former things, be it stoicheia, be it the law, in other words, the Mosaic law, that is, right? And Christ has redeemed us from under it. Right? There's an important part in regards to this telos, this purpose, or this teleology of Christ, right? He is born under the law in order to redeem those who are under the law. Do you see what He's saying? Okay? It's connected to, of course, the aspect of being born of a woman, just like we all are born of a woman, right? What this is saying is that in order to redeem us, He becomes one of us. This is what's so revelatory and unique about what is then obviously revealed in and through the Christian religion. In that sacrifices of the ancient pagan world were insufficient to deal with the fundamental problems incumbent and inherent within the human condition, okay, of our own sin, of our enslavement to the curse of original sin. Okay? The very lawgiver actually comes and places Himself under the law with a purpose of redeeming humanity who itself is under the law, who stands under its judgment, right? Under the stoicheia, or the elemental principles, back from verse, whatever it is, verse 3. Right? He becomes human in order to redeem humanity. Right? It was Saint Athanasius, it must have been, back in my mind. Yes, it was Saint Athanasius, 4th century. We studied him extensively, of course, in our church history course. Saint Athanasius once said, a rather pithy saying that has a quite profound meaning when actually understood correctly, at least in terms of what he meant. God became man in order that man might become God. Now, he does not mean that in the sense of overthrowing God. He doesn't mean it in the way that the serpent meant. He's actually using that and turning that into a rightful understanding. When he says God became man, that's obvious, in order that man might become God, what he is speaking of is the very concept that we have often in the English as sanctification. Okay? In Greek it was called, and still is called, theosis. Our word in English is a theosis, Theosis, from the root word theos, which means God. That's just the generic Greek word for God that you find anywhere here, just like, of course, in verse 4, verse 5, verse 6, verse 7, wherever you see the word God, that is the word theos, meaning God. Okay, so that's where we get the word theology from, right? Study of God. The English word sanctification, again, I'll go around in a circle to explain what I'm meaning. That comes from the Latin route. Obviously, in English, we speak a Western language, of course, so Latin is also fundamental to our language. From the Latin sanctus, meaning holy. Okay? So sanctification. It is the word that is used to describe what, for example, the Apostle Paul mentions in Romans chapter 8, verses 28 to 30. God works together for those who love him all good things, or in other words, God works all things together for the good of those who love him. Those whom he foreknew, he also predestined, against the verses go on to say, those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed into the image of his Son. Okay, so that's that aspect of what St. Athanasius is referring to, in order that man might become God, not capital G as in they will overthrow God and they become gods. He means become like God, okay, in regards to holiness, righteousness, the image, okay? It's exactly what the Apostle Paul's describing, right? That they may be conformed, shaped, moulded into the image of Christ, so that humanity returns back to the state of Eden, where we, as the image of God, truly reflected him, okay? Because after all, that is the inherent telos, there's that word again, of man, right? As the Lord says when he created us, right? Let us make man in our image. Right? Make man, in other words, humanity, like us, Father, Son, Spirit. Right? This is the purpose, right? And then he goes on to say, those whom he predestined, he called. Those whom he called, he justified. So in other words, made right with him. Those whom he justified, he glorified. Okay, so that's the future case, right, of glorification. This aspect of sanctification is that whole process that's kind of described along there, especially between justification and glorification. Why is this so important? Because the aspect here is that, and again, this is very much how the early church understood this, pretty much universally, is that just as I mentioned earlier with John chapter 1, verse 14, the Word became flesh. That's this aspect of God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, right? The Word, the Logos, became human, and he dwelt among us. Okay, he condescended to our level. He emptied himself, which is this phrase that the Apostle Paul describes in Colossians chapter 2, another very deeply philosophical book. He condescends to our level. God becomes man in order that he might raise man back up to the good and the heavenly things as we once had, right? To redeem us, in this case using this term, to redeem us who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons, right? In other words, the full inheritance of things, okay? That is the purpose of his mission, of his divine mission. God became man in order that we might become God. And when rightly understood as to what St. Athanasius was saying, he was saying it in the righteous sense, as opposed to the very twisted way, of course, which the serpent in the garden said in Genesis 3. In that case, he was talking about overthrowing, what we would call overthrowing. He was talking about rebellion, right? Exactly what he sought to do, which was to become the God, as we might say, to throw in the definite article, right? Sanctification, which is the Western term for it. Theosis, which is the Eastern Christian term for it, right? Latin, Greek derivatives, it's just language, right? Verse 6, and, so continuing the thought, because you are sons, right? So in other words, this has been done now, okay? So verse 6, and because you are sons, we've explained this whole notion of a titular reference, not a biological one. And because you are sons, because we have been adopted into the family of God, the body of Christ, right? Because we have been adopted into the kingdom of heaven, God sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Abba is a Aramaic phrase, ultimately, via in a Greek phrase in this particular case, right? Abba simply means father, right? So it's a repetition of the words. He's describing the adoption that occurs of a child, right? And he becomes the inheritor of things. This concept of Inheritance obviously has played its way all throughout the Old Testament, right? With the inheritance that Isaac received as opposed to Ishmael, Jacob as opposed to Esau. If you go through and read those chapters of Genesis, of course, right? That's all fundamental and central to many of those stories, right? The redemption of the Israelites out of the house of slavery, as the Bible calls it, Egypt, obviously is super relevant to Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, as we well know, right? All the way down throughout, you get to this particular point where what the Apostle Paul is fundamentally doing is saying that the fullness or the completion of these things has now come, okay? This is to use his phrase from the beginning of verse 4, the fullness of time, okay? That where God sent forth the Spirit of his Son, and there's it's not really our main point here, but as a tangential point, something that's really important for you to understand, is that this is one of those aspects where we actually have another Trinitarian or a Trinitarian reference. Okay, it's easy to miss it if you're not actually looking at it. But verse 6, God, which is a reference to the Father, sent forth the Spirit of his Son. Father, Son, Spirit. Okay? The Spirit is also described as the Spirit, but in a particular way here though, as the Spirit of the Son. Okay, so showing this interconnectedness within the Trinity, right? We've obviously explained many times that our ability as finite human beings in the dimensionality of our world do not have an ability to comprehend the true essence of the nature of God, because he is fundamentally not like us. Okay? We are just one person. We are Unitarian in that sense. Uni obviously meaning one. He is not. He is something different, and that should be expected because, after all, if there were other things like him, then there would be multiple gods. That should be obvious, right? This is why in paganism you do have multiple gods, because each god is just one person. Zeus is Zeus. Poseidon is Poseidon. Hades is Hades. Athena is Athena, right? To use the Greek example. And this plays itself out over and over and over again, right? But God, in the reality of his nature, is something entirely different, right? Which is philosophically to be expected if he is in fact God. God sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, right? And so showing the fact that we have been adopted as sons, using this titular form, by God, and that we therefore become the inheritors of all that the Son has. Right? Now, obviously, this is tying back to that whole notion of what we finished off in chapter 3, right? That if you are in Christ, you are the seed of Abraham, heirs according to the promise. Okay? So showing that connection, that human connection between us, Abraham, Christ is the thing that connects us all, right? Etc., etc. So we now, as Christians, as we've been doing for 2,000 years and counting, rightfully refer back to our father Abraham. Okay? Because the faith in the seed, or in other words, in the descendant, Christ himself, is the axis upon which the faith actually rests, we therefore are connected with Abraham by that very same faith through Christ. Right? The adoption as sons is spiritual, not genetic. Chapter 3, obviously, we saw all about that. And only those who are connected to Christ by faith, right, in him, are the true heirs of the promise, as according to Galatians chapter 3, basically the whole thing of it, but especially verses 28 and 29. Hence, verse 7, therefore, right, so consequently, you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. Okay? You are an heir because of God, or the work that he has done. Okay? I'll go through verse 7 just to, again, it's not complex, but just to tie it all together, right? Therefore, as a result of all this, you are no longer a slave. So we're no longer actually children. That's the kind of children that's being referred to, going all the way back to verse 1, right? We are no longer a slave, because keeping in mind in verse 1, the child is equated with being slave-like, not in the literal sense, but being slave-like in terms of inheritance and ownership, right? Therefore, you are no longer a slave, but a son, because we have been redeemed from slavery, the slavery to the stoicheia, the elementary principles, enslavement to the law, right? The Mosaic law, etc., etc. More on that next lesson, verse 8. But now we are a son. Now we have grown up. Now we have inherited all that the Father has given to us through his Son. Because we are in allegiance to his Son, because we are his body, right? That what we call the metaphysical body of Christ, right? Otherwise known as especially throughout church history, what was often called the mystical body of Christ. Okay. We therefore inherit everything that he has. Whatever he gets, we get. Not because of our own work, but that's why he finishes off, and if a son, then an heir through God. Theotheo, right? Through God, by God, in other words. Okay. As a result of God's work, we might more abstractly say, as a result of his mercy or his grace. Okay. That would be the more thematic understanding.